The group includes the Northern Virginia counties of Fairfax, Fauquier, Loudoun, and Prince William. The Sierra Club is active in many environmental areas, but concentrates on reducing the consumption of fossil fuels, which cause climate change, and protecting our natural environment. Focus areas for the Great Falls Group include energy efficiency, renewable energy, pipelines, data centers, land use, transportation, environmental justice, and other areas. We have a monthly digital newsletter and a weekly email available to the public describing local area environmental events. If you would like to find out more about the Sierra Club and maybe volunteer, we need your help, please let us know. Links will be provided in the follow-up email. Now, I would like to introduce Catherine Carver, the Great Falls Group Program Chair, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Catherine?
Catherine, you got on mute. Sorry.
I was trying to be so careful not to have background noise. So let me try again. Thank you, Norbert. Stephen Nash is a Richmond-based journalist who has been looking into proposals to reintroduce red wolves to Virginia. Stephen is the author of the award-winning books Blue Ridge 2020, Virginia Climate Fever, and the most recent Grand Canyon for Sale. His reporting and analysis have been published in Bioscience, The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and more than 36 Virginia and North Carolina newspapers. He is a visiting senior research scholar at the University of Richmond, and he says, "I'm a big fan of the good work of the Sierra Club." Here is Steve Nash.
All right, we got Steve. Okay, Steve, you're good.
So yeah, this is going to take place instead of being graded on your pre-last instead of the guy who was person.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a magnificent red wolf named Moose, who is currently a resident among us here in Virginia. He's actually one of 9 wolves at 9 red wolves at the Mill Mountain Zoo in Roanoke. Maybe some of you have been there. So thanks for that kind introduction, Catherine and Norbert. And thanks for all of your help pulling this together, Steve Gurney. I want to remind you of something you already know from the introduction. I'm a journalist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a wildlife biologist. So by definition, almost, I know very little about a few things, but I do have the privilege of talking to people who are indeed experts, and they do know what they're talking about. And I talk to them more or less on your behalf. So that's the information I'll be bringing you tonight. And you've been through PowerPoints and Zooms before. I'm confident of that. And so you know that there's likely to be glitches from time to time. Just hold on to your seats. We've got experts who can intervene, and we'll hope to get through without any of those, but they do tend to crop up. I'm going to give you a very, very fast talking flyover of what topics I'll be addressing tonight during my monologue, and I'll be very interested to know what your questions are, but we're going to hold them until you can type them out, but we're going to hold them and so I can answer them all at once when I'm done. You know how it is with PowerPoints, right? A whole bunch of text goes up on the screen and then the speaker reads the text. I'm going to try to restrain myself from doing that. I'm going to assume that you're literate and you can do that on your own. But if you catch me reading it, just bear with me. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit of an introduction of red wolves and their biology. Here's a map of what was the red wolf's range maybe 200 years ago. And as you can see here, it stretches from nearly the southern tip of Florida all the way up to the southern part of the state of New York, and then from the Atlantic seaboard all the way west past the Mississippi to Texas. So it was an enormous range, and in some ways this Commonwealth of Virginia was right smack in the middle of it. Red wolves are mostly brown and buff colored. As you can see, they have some black along their backs, and they often have a reddish color on their ears and head and legs. Adult red wolves stand at about 28 inches at the shoulder, and they're about 4 feet long from nose to tail. This is just a little illustration to show you the relative size of red wolves. The largest animal in this depiction is a gray wolf, and gray wolves are 180 to 120 pounds. Red wolves are intermediate between gray wolves and coyotes. Red wolves are 50 to 80 pounds. Coyotes are 15 up to about 44 pounds. And the smallest animal there is a red fox, about 10 or 15 pounds. Red wolves eat they eat about 2 to 5 pounds a day, and they prey on very young or otherwise vulnerable white-tailed deer. Also, medium-sized mammals like raccoons and smaller rabbits, rodents, and possums. And red wolves can travel up to 20 miles a day to find that food. They're an important animal as an apex predator, in one of the apex predators in a full ecosystem. And they control those deer populations, of which we have a superabundance in Virginia, as you know, and also control other small animal populations. Now, there's something else you may have heard about the biology of red wolves, and that is that they are actually not a separate species, that they're actually a kind of a mixture of coyotes and what used to be red wolves. Geneticists and wildlife biologists have been arguing the case for that and gathering evidence back and forth for 20 or 30 years, for as long as I've known about red wolves. But the National Academy of Sciences looked into this very important question a couple of years ago, and I'll tell you their conclusion in a moment. The reason it's important for red wolves is that if they are just a hybrid, they don't qualify for protection under the Endangered Species Act. And what the National Academy of Sciences concluded after reviewing all of the evidence, and that panel included the best geneticists they could find, was this sort of summary statement. Red wolves do interbreed with coyotes when there are very, very small red wolf populations. When there aren't any other mating opportunities available, they have been known to hybridize with coyotes. But the red wolf population that we now have in the wild that I'll be telling you about this evening, those have been tested genetically and they are a separate species. But the most important thing to know about the biology of red wolves is that they are just about gone. This is a billboard along the highway on the way to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in coastal North Carolina. And as it explains, red wolves are critically endangered. There are only a handful of them left in the wild, and then there are some in captive breeding circumstances, but they are the most endangered wolf. Here's a fever chart, and you can read plainly the message here. This is the wild red wolf population down there at Alligator River. 15 years ago, it had reached almost 150 individuals. They were doing fine. They were reproducing in the wild. they were getting along great, feeding and breeding and doing what wolves do. As of a few weeks ago, there are only 7 red wolves known to be alive, perhaps 2 or 3 more that don't have radio collars. But in the time that's passed since that report was made, we've probably lost some more of these animals. Well, how did this happen? I'm going to tell you next about most of an answer to that, the Fish and Wildlife Service rescue program that first brought red wolves back from the brink of extinction, then reintroduced them into the wild, and then more or less have abandoned them since. The wolves get along great in the wild. It's politics and the way their population has been managed that have caused that catastrophic decline that you saw on the chart. So let's return to this map and talk a little bit about how this all started. There were some exuberant years after the passage of the Endangered Species Act in the early 1970s. You may be able to read a label down here in the lower left that says source population, and that red blotch straddles the borderline between Texas and eastern Louisiana, the very marshy, thickety kind of area. This is where the last of the red wolves were living. So the idea that the Fish and Wildlife Service had to rescue them from vanishing entirely from the planet was to go down and capture the last examples of red wolves and then to raise them in captive breeding till they had a robust population and some of them could be released into the wild. So this would have been in the late 1970s. They captured 17 animals that were thought to be more or less pure red wolves. They captured actually 400 altogether, but most of them were declined because they had indeed hybridized with coyotes. Of the 17 that they caught, 14 of them actually bred and are the sort of source foundation for all of the red wolves that we have today. There are challenges to reintroducing red wolves in the wild, even if you have a lot of luck raising them in captive circumstances. It takes a lot of really innovative wildlife biology and a lot of experimentation that has occurred in the 40 years since the captive breeding started. It's really intriguing work. For one thing, you have to make sure there's enough for them to eat. And in some circumstances, we have impoverished our forests enough that there aren't enough of those small mammals to maintain a population of red wolves. So that's something that is part of any decision about where to reintroduce them. And then there are diseases. All animals get diseases of some kind, but red wolves are also susceptible of diseases of domestic dogs like parvovirus, and some part of their populations have had to contend with that. We've talked about inbreeding. You may have heard the expression inbreeding depression. These surviving red wolves have to be managed very, very carefully so that the genetics are strengthened rather than weakened. We talked about hybridizing with coyotes, and we'll talk a little more about that, but the worst problem for survival of red wolves in the wild is us. The chief cause of mortality for red wolves in the wild has been that they are shot to death by humans. Let's talk about the captive breeding program, which is supposed to be the sort of pipeline for reintroducing red wolves. It has been extremely successful. There's our friend Moose again, looking at the camera from inside the facility at the really tiny but marvelous Mill Mountain Zoo there in Roanoke. The plan that the Fish and Wildlife Service drew up in 1990, which was the last time they put together a plan for species recovery, that plan was to eventually have 3 independent populations of red wolves out in the wild, populations of about 100 each. So that's 300 animals out in the wild, and then 100, actually 53 breeding pairs was the goal. And that would be another 100 animals in captivity as a sort of a feeder population to release yet more red wolves into their former range. that was the goal. Actually, instead of just 100 animals in captivity now, those captive breeding facilities, there are 43 of them around the country, and they total around 250 more or less caged red wolves. They're at capacity. In fact, in some ways, they're beyond capacity, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get to. The North Carolina Zoo, maybe you've been there. It's a wonderful zoo in Greensboro, has about 24 red wolves currently. And just last May, 5 pups were born. They're getting more of them all the time and looking for places to put them. And of course, the question arises, well, why aren't they being put out in the woods, which was the goal of the program to begin with. Let me move sideways a little bit and talk about the prospects for reintroduction of red wolves in Virginia. If the question is, what are we waiting for? The answer is one I hope to provide in the next few minutes. A report was done a couple of years ago by the Center for Biological Diversity, and its purpose was to look around the country because the Fish and Wildlife Service had not done so, despite the fact that the Fish and Wildlife Service is the custodian for terrestrial endangered species in the United States by law. They're the agency that's supposed to be taking care of business for endangered species. But since 1990, they hadn't come up with any alternative sites to reintroduce red wolves. So the Center for Biological Diversity did it for them. And here's what they said. I know many of you, perhaps all of you, are familiar with our wonderful George Washington and Jefferson National Forests in the western part of the state. These are all public lands, lands to which we hold the deeds of trust. And the report pointed out that they're contiguous, they're connected, and they're also contiguous with the big, substantial Monongahela National Forest in eastern West Virginia, and they're not far from Shenandoah National Park. So their conclusion was, among the sort of constellation of places they said red wolves might do very well, they picked Virginia and eastern West Virginia. But that opinion is not unanimous. I also talked to a couple of wildlife biologists who think that the eastern shore, the Delmarva Peninsula, would be a great place to reintroduce red wolves. One of them is Joey Hinton, Dr. Hinton, has been working with red wolves in reintroduction efforts for about the last 20 years, and here's what he had to say. One thing to remember about red wolves is that for a pack to thrive on the average landscape, the average wild landscape, they need about 77 square miles of territory. That's about 55,000 acres. And what that means is that in most circumstances, they may be based in public lands, but they are also going to need the cooperation of private landowners, many of whom are very enthusiastic about the prospect of having endangered species inhabit their property, and some of whom are not. But private landowners will, of necessity, wildlife biologists told me, of necessity, they're going to have to be part of the equation for reintroduction. One of the agencies in Virginia that have a lot to say about the possibility of reintroducing red wolves is our newly rebranded Department of Wildlife Resources. You may know them as the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. That changed a couple of months ago. I spoke with Michael Fees, who has experience with reintroducing wild species in Virginia, especially the mountain areas. So he's one of the people who would have something to say about this. And he has responded to the report from the Center for Biological Diversity that I told you about, the one that recommended red wolves. Let's hear what he has to say.
Another problem would be, simply human conflicts. And we would expect the public in that area I would believe, would be overwhelmingly opposed to the idea, the locals. And the number one cause of mortality of the red wolves in eastern North Carolina is animals being shot. It's very difficult to distinguish red wolves from coyotes from a distance anyway, particularly for an untrained person. So I think there's a lot of red wolves in North Carolina that are being shot either by accident or in many cases intentionally. And I would expect that would be a significant issue in the mountains of Virginia.
Do you think the Wildlife Resources Agency could have any hope of convincing the local population that this is a great idea and an exciting thing to save the species, assuming all those other problems could be resolved?
Yeah, well, that's a big assumption that all these other problems could be resolved. And bottom line is that I see no reason why Virginia would have a successful release, because I think we have even more challenges than where they've released them in eastern North Carolina.
That sounds pretty daunting.
Yeah, I love the canids, the large canids and coyotes and wolves, but I just don't think it's a feasible alternative in the mountains of Virginia. Another problem would be.
So let's revisit that chart. I'm going to be showing it to you one more time, just because it tells the story so simply. What really explains why a very successful reintroduction effort has gone so far south, and why we have so many animals in a great innovative captive breeding program and they're stuck there? Well, here's what an attorney for the Southern Environmental Law Center had to say. SELC and the Defenders of Wildlife and a couple of other groups have been litigating for the last 15 years to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to meet its legal responsibilities on behalf of red wolves. This is a story that plays out with other populations of predators, endangered predators all across the country. What are the things that the Fish and Wildlife Service has done since the program was doing so well 15 years ago? Well, the first thing they did was to stop reintroducing captive bred wolves. And then an unprecedented act, the Atlanta office of the Fish and Wildlife Service began to issue permits to landowners to kill these endangered species without showing that they were causing any trouble. By law, you're allowed to shoot wolves if you have to, but you don't get to shoot them just because you don't like them. And the Fish and Wildlife Service said, yeah, that's okay with us. And they began issuing permits. Well, they were stopped in federal court. The judge said that's absolutely a violation of the law that you're supposed to be upholding. But it gives you a feeling for the posture of the Fish and Wildlife Service. They halted some of the wonderful strategies that the wildlife biologists were using, including cross-fostering of pups, which is sort of adopting pups into litters of other wolf packs. And the reason for that is to strengthen the genetics. It was another great success. One of the ways that interbreeding with coyotes was halted, and it worked really well, was to sterilize some of the coyotes until the red wolf population could get big enough that all of those mating opportunities were there. That was working very well too. The Fish and Wildlife Service told its own biologists to stop doing that. And for years, they were not at all transparent about what was happening with the red wolf population. We've mentioned that the chief cause of red wolf mortality is getting shot to death. Some of that may be on purpose. Some of it may be because they're mistaken for coyotes. But in all cases, the Fish and Wildlife Service declined to investigate or prosecute. And they finally cut their own staff back severely, so there's almost nobody left working at the Alligator River Red Wolf Reintroduction Program. And finally, and a federal judge put a stop to this also, they reduced the reintroduction area by 90%, which was almost a guarantee that the population would be tiny. The Defenders of Wildlife is one of the groups that has been working on this. They've been working in the field with organizing support of landowners and trying to meet the objections of people who are concerned about red wolves. They've also been a party to the array of lawsuits that have been filed against the Fish and Wildlife Service on the wolves' behalf. And here's what she told me when I inquired about this.
Many of the local landowners in this area just truly and deeply hate Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government. And so in a lot of ways, the red wolves have become this proxy for the federal government because, and this is a little assumption on my part, but I think some of these people see a red wolf and they're like, oh, well, you know, if I shoot and kill that wolf, that's kind of, it's sticking it to the man. And so that's really the atmosphere we've kind of reached today. You know, from my perspective, the biologists on the ground are incredible human beings. They are wonderful. They are dedicated. They are the salt of the earth, and they want this program to succeed. And they love wildlife, and they love the refuge program. That sentiment is not shared all the way up the chain. So we have this situation where we have very, very dedicated, hardworking biologists on the ground who are trying desperately to save this species and wheel and deal and do anything and everything they have the authority to do. But then in Atlanta, at the regional level, the leadership, by all accounts, really seems to be trying to ignore this species to death. Many of the local...
Here's a sort of a mock billboard on a local anti-red wolf, anti-Fish and Wildlife Service website that gives you the flavor of what some of the local opposition is like. I'm hoping you can see this chart and that it's not kind of abbreviated by your Zoom screen, but don't worry if it is. I'm going to explain what all this means. Another feature of some of my favorite PowerPoint presentations is that a whole bunch of text and a whole bunch of bar chart stuff goes up on the screen, and then we all have to get out magnifying glasses to figure out what's going on. I'll explain to you what's going on with this, but let me just introduce the survey that was taken a couple of years ago by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They do this periodically. The Union of Concerned Scientists polls the scientists who are working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and basically they're asking, how bad is the political interference that you're facing? If you can make it out, you can see that it's pretty bad in this bar chart. The influence of political appointees in your agency or department is the orange bar in the middle, and almost, well, between 15 and 20% of the scientists said, yeah, it's a problem. Also, absence of leadership with needed scientific expertise and limited staff capacity. I want to point out that most of us would jump to the conclusion that this is all the sort of toxic influence of the late and unlamented Donald Trump administration. But in fact, these problems at the Fish and Wildlife Service predate Trump. They were very bad during the Obama administration, And they have been since the close, really, of the Clinton administration. So it's part of the culture of the agency. It isn't something we can just lay at the, lay at the doorstep of Trump and company. Here's another question about whether staff and funds are distributed away from programs that the Fish and Wildlife Service is worried are too politically contentious. And I'll just skip to the summary of these findings. A quarter of these scientists at the agency said that they have been asked or told to avoid work on topics that might be some kind of politically radioactive. More than half of them said that funds and staff are channeled elsewhere if anything's happening that's a political threat to the agency. And a walloping majority concluded that political interests are a burden to science, to the attempt to do science at the agency. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service should be depending hugely on the work of its own scientists. That's the nature of what it's in business for. Well, I hope that goes some way toward explaining, once again, this graph. That's the last time you'll have to see it. In 2017, a couple of dozen wildlife biologists who were familiar with wolf biology wrote a letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and here is what they recommended, not for the first time and not for the last. The advice was ignored. I want to pause here for a minute because I know it may sound like I'm demonizing the Fish and Wildlife Service. And indeed, there are a lot of negative things to say about them. But I think that's too easy for us to do. I think we should put ourselves in the shoes, not of the wildlife biologists on the front lines of projects like Red Wolf Reintroductions, but those middle-level bureaucrats or even higher, or some of the higher echelons in Washington. What we have asked them to do with the Endangered Species Act is defend red wolves and Mexican wolves and lynxes and a bunch of other predators. But the public support for those things is not as loud, is not as strenuous, and it isn't as consistent as the support for getting rid of those species from the people who don't like them. It's been shown again and again that they're in a tiny minority. There is huge public support, spoken support, lip service support for the Endangered Species Act. But that agency, what we're asking those guys and those women to do is sort of fall on their swords and be super courageous and heroic and stand up to people who are ready to go to their congressmen and give a lot of trouble and threaten budget cuts. And we've been asking them to do that without a very healthy show of how important it is for the Endangered Species Act to be taken care of and for programs like the Red Wolf Reintroduction to go forward successfully. So I just feel some humility about finding enemies and then smiling and proceeding. I think we've got some work to do about giving them the political support they need to be courageous. One of the people who has spent her career working with wolves in captive breeding programs is Maggie Howell. She's at the Wolf Conservation Center in New York. They've got a couple of dozen red wolves there. And I talked to her about how she has been feeling about what's been happening at Alligator River. Remember, the reason they raise these wolves in captivity is so that they can be reintroduced.
If I'm talking to people in Virginia or Western North Carolina or Arkansas or someplace about the possibility of reintroducing red wolves there, would you welcome that possibility for the wolves that?
I don't know if we would.
You would love to see your wolves back in the wild in some new reintroduction program, but only if the Fish and Wildlife Service takes better care of them?
Yeah. It's really discouraging. And again, not only discouraging for our staff and our volunteers and and everyone, but we want all of our constituents to care about these animals and to support recovery in the wild. We don't want to have captive wolves forever. The whole purpose of having these animals is we really want them to be functioning as viable wolves on the wild landscape. We want them to be doing what they do, hunting and having pups and having their ecological impact on their native ecosystem. That's where they belong.
If I'm talking.
Here's some news just from the last few days. A federal judge has ordered the Fish and Wildlife Service to release more red wolves from those captive populations into the wild at Alligator River. It makes you scratch your head wondering why federal judges have to get the agency to do what it is supposed to do by law and to stop doing things that undermine its own programs. But anyway, it was a positive step, and he wasn't willing to say, yeah, so take a couple of years and have some committee meetings and come up with a plan. What he said was those reintroductions should start immediately in the first week of March. It's a great positive, but very short-term solution when you remember that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been dragging its feet for decades. Another piece of positive news, this from just this past October. 2 of our Virginia congressmen sit on the House Natural Resources Committee. It's Don Beyer and Don McEachin. And they, along with Raul Grijalva, who's the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, wrote a very long and detailed letter to the then Secretary of the Interior and 2 of his top officials in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, urging them to intervene immediately to save the red wolf program. That letter was signed by a couple of dozen of their colleagues in Congress. So the agency is beginning to feel the heat and perhaps beginning to build some momentum toward getting something done. That letter from the Natural Resources Committee specified many things, but here's one of the things they said that's going to be needed for red wolves to survive. What people who work with wolf programs in the West say about the hostility to predators on the ground is that some people just shoot, shovel, and shut up. We don't want to send red wolves or any other animals into that kind of a situation in Virginia. So what this paragraph from that congressional letter is pointing out is that there has to be a very thorough and careful education process for the people who live in those counties where red wolves would be reintroduced. They have to be shown, and maybe in some cases they have to be incentivized in order to have positive feelings about having this wonderful animal around. You know, we could reintroduce them into the suburbs where maybe you live, but you might be thinking, wait a minute, a wolf right at my back door? It's something from a bad fairy tale, right? The thing about red wolves is that in the 30 years of the Alligator River program, there were only 6 confirmed episodes of predation. A chicken, somebody's pet, 6 in 30 years. The Virginia State Department of Health told me that in 2019, there were 10,000 reported attacks on humans by another canid that we're all much more familiar with. Domestic dogs, 10,000 bites a year, and some of them are extremely serious, and a lot of those are unreported, so 10,000 is definitely a low figure. We've accommodated that. The idea that we couldn't learn to accommodate a red wolf in the wild, they're very shy of humans. They rarely cause any trouble. They almost never attack livestock the idea that we can't do that seems strange when we look at it in context. Well, another objection would be it's too expensive. We can't do it. Money's short. Government has to do a lot of stuff. We don't want to be unsympathetic, but can't spend a lot of money on red wolves. Fortunately, it costs only $2,000 a year, even with all the attention from all of the people involved, $2,000 a year to keep a red wolf in captive circumstances or out in the wild. So actually, it's not too expensive. And yes, we can do it. Maybe more resonant is the objection that with the way our politics are now, the polarization, wolves would be a lightning rod, everybody would get upset. We just can't do that. Environmentalists have too many battles to fight. Let's not add another explosive kind of campaign into the mix. That objection reminds me of the early 1960s when the Federal Bureau of Reclamation wanted to throw a dam across the Colorado River that would have flooded part of Grand Canyon National Park. And the wise advice in Washington then from environmental leadership was, let's just let them do it. There are so many other important things we're pursuing right now. We just can't worry about Grand Canyon. It's going to take time and money away from the other things that we feel we have to do. But one person who wouldn't listen to that advice was the head of the Sierra Club, a name many of you are familiar with, David Brower. David Brower listened to all that, and here was his response. And I think we could ask the same question about red wolves. If we cannot save this species, on which tens of millions of dollars have been spent, on which people have spent whole careers protecting and pulling them back from extinction. If we can't save that, what the hell can we save? Well, what's the ask here? If this is something that's of interest to you, the ask is that you contact your state delegates and state senators for your district here in Virginia and ask them to get started, not on a study of whether this should happen, but a study of how to make it happen, which is a completely different orientation. At the state level, there's going to be a lot of inertia against red wolves, but action like that is the only thing that's going to ensure their survival. VPAP.org, that's the website of the Virginia Public Access Project, and you can, with a couple of keystrokes, find out how to contact those delegates and senators. You can also write and contact very easily. This is some Googling that would take you no time at all. Matthew Strickler, who's our Virginia Secretary of Natural Resources. And while you're at it, you can write Governor Northam. He's got nothing better to do these days. I wish that were true. And if you have any questions for me that occur to you after we break up this evening, this is my email address. I'd be pleased to send you a couple of articles that I've written, one for the Washington Post about reintroducing red wolves in Virginia, and one about the betrayals of the Fish and Wildlife Service for the Progressive magazine that came out a few weeks ago. Just let me know if you have interest, and I'd be more than happy to send those to you. Thank you very much for letting me bend your ear. I'll be very pleased to know what you're curious about.
Well, Steve, we've got lots of questions, and I think as some people have commented, we probably got a lot of dogs and cats in our homes that are running around not knowing what's going on.
That's right.
So I'm just going to start, you know, on the comments, reading the questions that were typed in, and remind everybody that you can also raise your hand if you'd like to verbally ask a question. But the first one on the list is James, who says, can red wolves be introduced to the Great Dismal Swamp?
Yes. Yeah, they can. And in fact, I say that quite lightly, but I hope I've been balanced in telling you what some of the opposition would look like. But some wildlife biologists have actually figured out how red wolves could disperse, even with all the roads and strip malls and everything else in their way, how they could disperse along the coastline and make it on their own to the Great Dismal Swamp. Remember that one wolf pack, though, needs 77 square miles. That's 50-some thousand acres. So the Dismal Swamp is big enough for a limited population of the animals, but anywhere you could put them where they could find enough to eat would help keep them from becoming extinct.
Great. Kripa asks, I hope I pronounced that name correctly. Wait, I'm confused. Why wouldn't the pups be placed with the mom who would presumably nurse them?
The idea is that each one of those pups has a certain array of genetics, and that if they stay with the same animals that gave birth to them, that same close family, they're going to have really limited mating opportunities because the wild population is still very small. What you want to do is take that package of DNA that they represent and introduce it into another pack of red wolves that are much more distant relatives, so that you don't have that sort of problem, I guess you'd call it, of incest. Inbreeding depression leads to deformations of various kinds, and red wolves already suffer from a little bit of that because the founding population was so small, but that's the reason for cross fostering.
Okay. Janik asks, what are the key threats to reintroduction of red wolves? What do we need to educate and prepare the relevant population for?
I'm going to stammer when I try to answer that, not because I think it's impossible, but because I don't have detailed knowledge of it. That's actually where my reporting is going to go next. Some of you may have read that in Colorado, there was a referendum just a couple of months ago on whether to reintroduce gray wolves into that state, and it won. However, the gray wolves are going to be going into those rural areas that were very heavily opposed. So there are a couple of institutes at the University of Colorado that study predator and human interactions, and they've been working on plans for how to get the human population ready to be hospitable to the wolves instead of trying to kill them off. And I have yet to talk to them. I'll be really interested to hear what they have to say. The letter from the congressman specified that people should be shown that if you have a magnificent animal like this on your landscape, it can mean a lot of good things economically. One researcher told me that he thinks that in another generation, people will be fighting for the chance to have rare species of plants and animals in their backyard. We just have to get that positive attitude started. I'm going to finish this rather too long response by pointing out, though, that when people look at a program like this and they inhabit a sort of a Fox News county out there in Western Virginia, they don't see a wonderful animal that won't harm them. What they see is something that represents the government making another imposition on them. That's an attitude that has to be altered too, and a rather longer conversation. So I should have shrugged and just said, I don't know. But I think there are ways to do this. It's just a patient process that we really have to be committed to.
Great. Janik asks, what are the key, we already did that. Okay. Let's see. Kripa says, wasn't Congress Republican controlled for most of the Obama term? Uh-oh, we're going down the politics here.
Yeah, it sure was. But Obama appointed the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or his Interior Secretary did. And that gentleman, during the 8 years of the Obama presence at the top of the federal government, that person backpedaled again and again and gave up whenever he could arrange to protections for endangered species. and his predecessor during the Bush administration did the same kind of stuff. People in Washington may not have the strongest connection to the concerns of wildlife and endangered species. They do have a strong connection to their own political survival. So I'm sorry to say that it wasn't the Republican Congress, which was extremely hostile, you're right, to endangered species. That was the principal problem at the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was the Obama appointed chief.
I just glanced at this. This is an interesting question that's in chat and not the Q&A from Mike G. Is there a possibility of artificial insemination programs similar to the black-footed ferret to keep the gene pool active and viable?
I know that that's been done in the Midwest, the upper Midwest. For instance, in Minnesota and upper Michigan, when gray wolves were reintroduced. I know that there are artificial ejaculators that have been applied to beavers, that they need artificial insemination for one reason or another. So yeah, it doesn't sound like any fun for the wolves, but I bet it can be done. I don't really know.
Okay. And Mary Kay says, regarding the killing of the red wolf, the response was, I thought it was a coyote. Why are we killing the coyote?
Complicated question. If you're a hunter, your answer would be because they're bad and they're fun to shoot at. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I'm not taking swipes at hunters. But in North Carolina, the feeling about coyotes is that they're sort of vermin and you don't want them around. Actually, they cause almost no harm either. But the fact that they are an available target and that the state of North Carolina has encouraged people to go shoot them means that they make interesting quarry for the recreation of hunting them. It's really fair to say that they are difficult to distinguish, especially at 100 yards from a red wolf. But one of the things that's been suggested and that the Fish and Wildlife Service has not followed through on in any aggressive way is to put special vests of some kind, something that makes red wolves immediately identifiable. If indeed some of these killings are a case of mistaken identity, that would help a lot.
Let's see, Donna Shaughnessy from the Sierra Club Piedmont group says, thank you so much. Mary Larson says, this is a cause that begs to be made into a PBS documentary, something with broad reach that could capture the public's imagination and especially kids. Does something like that already exist, or is it in the works?
I don't think anything on that scale has been done, at least not that I know of. There have been some smaller scale efforts and very good ones. There are a couple of documentaries that have been done that are very moving. And there is news coverage from time to time. The Washington Post has done quite a good job of following the red wolf story and hasn't pulled punches about the recalcitrance of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But no, it would be great if network TV got involved. That would be terrific.
Great. Let's see. Janet asks, are there any lessons to be learned from the introduction of gray wolves in the Yellowstone in terms of similar initial challenges with support and administration?
Yes, the lesson I would take away from Yellowstone, I take two away. One is that the wolf reintroductions in Yellowstone succeeded beautifully. It's a huge area, and so it enjoys some protections that our national forests wouldn't. But it's been really, really great for the ecosystem. And that's a story you can easily find. The impact that wolves have had on moose populations, the impact that has had on regenerating stream banks and other sensitive areas, the return of bird life and insect life in those areas. There's a cascading beneficial effect from wolf reintroduction. I don't know whether we could promise the same thing about red wolf reintroduction, but it could happen. The other lesson I would take away isn't biological. The reason why they pulled it off in Yellowstone, despite enormous local hostility, was because they stuck to it. It took years to get this done, and the fight is still there, and there still is shoot, shovel, and shut up in the Yellowstone area too. But the commitment was to make the reintroduction work, and it did.
Great. Someone asks, you probably covered this, but if nothing was done, when will the red wolves be extinct?
The situation is that if we're talking about animals in the wild, living on their own, they're as good as gone already. As I mentioned, there are only 7 of them left, maybe fewer because that report was from a few weeks ago, and they disappear rapidly, sometimes from natural causes and more often not. So I don't know that the court order that I mentioned is in time to save that dwindling population. But we still have 250 red wolves in captive breeding. It'll take a while to get them ready to be reintroduced, but that's what they're there for. And they've been raised very carefully, minimal interactions with humans, as many experiences in simulated wild circumstances as those biologists could arrange. So that's where they would come from. We're much too close to extinction, but we do have that population, thank heavens, to rely on. That's why this is a possibility at all. If it weren't, my talk tonight would just be a sort of a eulogy for a species that's not with us anymore.
Allison asks, I may have missed it, but why are the Carolinas against red wolves? Is it just because they eat their domestic animals?
It's complex in some ways and maybe simple in others. If you have a particular political orientation and a social orientation, this is an example of government overreach, a phrase you may have heard. It's an example of people who live in cities and suburbs who have romantic ideas about endangered species, making people in conservative rural areas pay the price of their daydreams. If you see a wolf that way, you're going to be tempted to shoot it, even if you don't have a gun. If you see it as an example of liberal politics run amok. But I think the real basis for the opposition is not the behavior of the wolves, and that's the hopeful thing. If you can point out to people that they really don't cause any trouble, they will take an occasional deer, but some biologists say that makes the deer populations a lot healthier, a lot more fun to hunt also. I think that in a sort of an unintelligible way sketches out what the opposition to red wolves seems to be in places like rural North Carolina.
Okay, let's see. All right. Juan says, it sounds like the most important aspect is public opinion of having red wolves in their backyard. Are there any regions more likely to welcome them? Should that be a driving factor?
Well, I think Great Falls, Virginia would be a great place to try out the possibility of having them in suburban areas. We already have a lot of wild dogs on the loose, and we already have a lot of wild coyotes. So it's not as if those haven't been accommodated already. But more seriously, the Delmarva Peninsula on the east and those big, beautiful national forests, which are well connected on the west, are probably the best shot for red wolves being able to survive out in nature.
Okay, and then let's see. This Kripa says and she may be commenting to something that you said. You'd want to make sure there's a postpartum female among them then, correct? I'm not sure what she's responding to.
Yeah, somebody has to nurse those cross-fostered pups. You're exactly right.
Okay, now the remaining questions that I've got relate, I think, more to like action and policy issues, sort of a good way for us to close out in what we as a group can do to affect change. Mary Kay asks, where would be the best place to donate money for the Red Wolf?
I can tell you who is most active in pushing the Fish and Wildlife Service. But I hate for this just to be about stroking a check, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing to do, and a really good act. Everybody needs money to get these kinds of things done. But I think beyond that, it's letter writing campaigns, it's phone calls, it's meetings, it's invitations to legislators who can influence those state agencies that are even more necessary. Not form letters that somebody prints out from online, but a real effort to get in touch with these people who represent you and your interests in the state. The people who have been at the forefront in litigating against the Fish and Wildlife Service and on behalf of these animals are the Southern Environmental Law Center, the SELC. I think one of its headquarters is in Charlottesville and the other one's in Charlotte and maybe also Atlanta. But they've been doing a great job. And they're often joined by the Defenders of Wildlife in filing those lawsuits, and also the Center for Biological Diversity.
Okay, great. And your comment there is considering it's about lobbying the decision makers and administrators, what can we do to build that lobbying capacity? And I think you just shared some comments there on that question. You
could get in touch with your favorite environmental group here in Virginia and talk over the possibilities with them.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of people that could answer those questions now. Creepa asks, did Conley sign the bill?
I'm sorry.
Jerry Conley, did Jerry Conley sign the bill? I guess that relates to.
Oh, you mean the letter?
The letter, I'm sorry.
I don't have it in front of me, and I don't recall, but there were a lot of signers. It was really gratifying to see that. And one of them was our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. Our first Native American Interior Secretary signed that letter on behalf of Red Wolves.
And let's see, we just got a couple more. Susan Barron says, almost all the communities you mentioned have large black bear populations. If people can coexist with them, then why not red wolves?
That's beautiful, and it helps us answer an earlier question about how could you encourage people who would be living in the reintroduction area that this won't cause harm for them, that it's something that they can get along with. Yes, black bears populations are very healthy in Virginia. And despite the fact that there is hunting pressure, they're doing okay. And we don't hear a lot of, there are incidents from time to time, very, very rare, but they do happen. And there's news coverage when a hiker gets mauled by a bear. And I think a couple of years ago, one was even killed by a bear, but there's no effort to make bears extinct in Virginia as a result.
All right, and our last comment from Chris Rich. Thank you very much for this presentation. Can you please repeat your email address? Now, I saw on the screen you put up a different email address. I've got a Richmond EDU address.
Yeah, the quickest way through is Stephen with a PH, Stephen Paul Nash 22.
Stephen Paul Nash 22
@gmail.com.
@gmail.com. Okay, everybody, I just put that into the chat box there. So with that, I think we've got through most of the questions. I wasn't able to really dive into chat, but it looks like most of the questions were in Q&A. So how about if I bring back on Norbert and Catherine, the hosts, to thank you and close out the meeting here.
Well, don't hit my mute button until I've had a chance to express my real gratitude to all of you out there who were curious about this issue. It's been really, really fun to tell you about red wolves.
Great. And so Catherine and Norbert, would you like to say a few words to close the meeting out?
Well, I wanted to say thank you for one of the best presentations I've ever seen on any subject. But thank you for being here and taking the time to tell us about the red wolves. I thought this was just an absolutely stellar presentation and so well organized. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I likewise, it was just a great presentation. And I really appreciate the participants participating in this. And we might take an action to form a interest group in this to really push this, because I certainly don't want the red wolves to go by the way of the passenger pigeon and so many other species. So, and as our natural areas get reduced in size, the natural environment gets smaller and smaller. It's going to be more difficult to keep these species alive in their natural habitat. So thank you, Steve Nash. Thank you, Steve Gurney, for the wonderful technical support. We really appreciate that. So
Yes.
Great.
thanks to everybody.
And just as a reminder, I'll be downloading the recording. So if you've got a friend or somebody of influence, I'll make sure that Norbert and Catherine get it so that it can be shared.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.